Welcome back to 40 Minute Mentor, the podcast on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category defining founders, all in just 40 minutes.
Following last week's episode curating some of the best advice we've had from VCs over the years, this week we thought we'd highlight some of the brilliant fundraising advice that founders have shared on our show. You may have listened to some of these episodes before, but if you're currently in the middle of fundraising, this episode is designed to inspire, motivate, and offer support. We know fundraising is extremely tough, particularly right now, and it can be all-consuming. So today you're going to hear from some of the very best founders who have been exactly where you are today. Avion, co-founder and CEO of Belong, who raised the biggest rounds for a female investor at pre-seed stage. Alice Pelton, co-founder and CEO of the Lowdown. Facey, founder and CEO of Audiomob. Serunjogi, co-founder and CEO of the unicorn, Chippercash. Gold medal Olympian Dame Jessica Ennis-Hill, who also is the co-founder of a FemTech business called Jennis. Molly Johnson-Jones, co-founder and CEO of Flexa. Nicolas co-founder of Ankorstore, a double unicorn and exited founder. Simone, Maini, CEO of Elliptic. And last but not least, Chong, co-founder and CEO of Yonder. In this episode, you are going to hear from some of my all-time favourite guests. So if you like what you've heard in today's clips and haven't listened to the full episode yet, then make sure you dive into the 40 Minute Mentor archives. But for now, I'll leave you with these brilliant founders and hope you find it as inspiring and insightful as I did.
Yeah, I do count my blessings and I do acknowledge that we've been able to raise a considerable amount of money. But I think what's most important, and I hope what doesn't get lost in the whole narrative, is that in my experience, more than anything, I think perseverance is probably what counts the most. You know, the stories about how much money we've raised are very well told. You can Google that and see, 100 million here and 30 million there, whatever. But I think what the story that isn't told is the considerable walls that I run into and the number of rejections that I got, very early on trying to raise money for the company. And I think every founder can relate to that, especially in the very early days of the company. But particularly for us, Major and I are two, when we started the company, we're two 24-year-old first time, African founders in Silicon Valley trying to raise money. We had no track record of ever starting a company anywhere. We're young, we just out of college. Being in that sort of situation isn't the most optimal for raising money.
I was going to say the odds are stacked against you there, aren't they?
Yeah,
really?
There's many other ways you can be better positioned to raise money than that. And obviously I was naive when it started because I thought it would be straightforward, and I run into very many walls and rejections, and some were less kind than others. And, it took a toll on me and how difficult that process was. But the fact that we just stuck through it and kept going, I think more than anything is what sort of allowed us to get to this point. We believed deeply in what we wanted to do. So we were sort of going to do it no matter what. I was talking to a friend who will remain unnamed at this point. But I was talking to a friend the other day, and they were saying, you guys are like cockroaches. You just don't die. And in many ways, that's kind of true, right? It's like we were so committed to doing this thing and seeing it through that it was going to take almost, the world ending for us to give up. And in that perseverance and in that stubbornness and that relentlessness to give in was sort of what allowed us to see the light. And by light, I mean eventually get to a point where we had investors that looked at the company seriously and wanted to invest in it. Getting that first yes, then, being able to scale the company to the next stage and the stage after that and to where we are today, that's very important. And then obviously beyond that, there are obviously technical aspects that come into it, which is, how do you, like I talked about being a salesperson to employees, how are you setting the narrative and the vision of your company? If you're looking to bring investors on board, and good investors, that is, how well do you sort of tell your vision to someone else and they want to be a part of your company and also want to actually buy into your company and have actual ownership and exposure to your potential success? that's a hard story to tell. And sometimes, and let's discount the importance of being able to clearly articulate your vision. That's a big part of being able to attract the right people around the table, investors or advisors or otherwise. And that's a big part of being able to set the company up for success. And then obviously, you learn as you go along. I'm a significantly better negotiator now than I was when I first raised our first round of money. It's a learning process, and allowing yourself the flexibility and the leeway to grow and improve is important. I look back at some of my initial pitch decks or emails that I sent to investors and I cringe. I'm like, oh my goodness, I actually said that.
I think that's a rite of passage, isn't it? You gotta have a few of those.
Yeah.
I look back at the very first JBM website and I die inside. But these things do happen, and it's all part of the journey.
Exactly. Yeah. So but that being said, I'm incredibly grateful for what we've been able to achieve as a company. You're right to say that we've raised an astonishing amount of money, and I don't take that lightly. I don't want to come off as if I'm obnoxious to that. I'm not. I'm incredibly grateful for us being able to raise that amount of capital to invest aggressively and to grow the business. And I'm fully aware that most companies don't get to be able to do that. So I'm deeply grateful that we're a business that's been able to do that.
It was a massive learning curve for myself as founder and Jane co-founder, and myself, Jane, and our CEO. We kind of went through lots of conversations, lots of meetings, and lots of moments where you feel that things are going really positive, and then it dips a bit, and then you're back up again. So it's a massive emotional roller coaster. Again, something that I've experienced before in sport, but you're slightly out of your comfort zone. And it was really interesting speaking to lots of different investors, and a lot of male investors as well, to try and explain firstly who we are, what we're about, what we're trying to achieve, and also there was that added level of trying to explain like the value of what we're trying to do and how much value it brings to so many women, because this is still an area that is not hugely researched. There's not loads of data out there saying this and that, and the funding's not necessarily there. So it was quite challenging at times to kind of convince certain people as the importance of 50% of the population are women, and we're kind of we have all these hormones that are changing and all these major life phases that we go through that actually does require a lot of attention and time, and is something that's hugely valued and important. So yeah, it was definitely very interesting, but we had some great conversations, and we now have some great investors, and we're able to continue building what we're building and evolving what we're doing as well, which is super exciting.
Fundraising it definitely is challenging. I would say try to, especially at the early stage, so at the pre-seed and seed stage where you're kind of really still in the building phase, like I would say try to screen investors as best as you can going in. I know that's really hard because at pre-seed stage, people typically have less of a network, want to cast a wider net, and I get that, but I think it's important to try and screen as best as you can. So you spend your time with people who probably have the highest likelihood of investing, or at least really listening and spending that quality time with you, listening and digging into it. Because at pre-seed stage, you probably don't have the public market proof points. So you really need investors who are going to sit with you, pay attention, ask the right questions. And a way that you can do some of this screening is by talking to other founders about investors, doing your referencing, back channeling, talking to angels, looking at the investor's portfolio. Make sure they understand exactly where you are in the process going in before you take a meeting. Like, this is where we are stage-wise. Do you think it's a good fit? Because fundraising can be exhausting, and I think it's really important to spend time with the right people who just won't waste your time. I would say also just focus on fleshing out the problem, right? That is massive. Selling your team, that you're the best people to solve a big problem, a big addressable market. Because I think at the earliest stage, these are the things that really matter the most. The solution that you have today needs to make sense as a starting point, but it's liable to change. I would say make sure your deck looks good. I think looks do matter. and that you tell the story succinctly and it's captivating and engaging. And just try to validate as many proof points as you can that the pain exists, the problem exists, and customers exist for this problem and that they really want to pay to solve it.
There's a reason that, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs tend to get tens of millions of dollars at very high valuations with a lot less of a physical business or a physical product than in London or Europe. And I guess it's the difference between pitching the whole vision of the IP that you have and what you're going to build out versus orienting around your MRR, monthly recurring revenue. So we learned very quickly that while, getting to 100K MRR opens up a Series A conversation or a little bit less, the real value add isn't concentrating on the MRR of what you're going to do in 3 years. It's what IP you're going to build out in order to justify that this will be $1 billion business in 3, 4, 5 years, and how you're going to get to $10 billion plus, in eight years or more. So that was a challenge, kind of figuring out how to pitch more like they do in Silicon Valley, rather than what is more common in Europe.
And how did you go about actually learning to pitch in that way? Were you just talking to lots of entrepreneurs that have raised in the valley, or what was the secret sauce?
So we developed tranches of investors like you would a sales pipeline, right? We had the dream investors, we had the tier 1s, 2, 3, 4s, and then there's the non-strategics in our field. And we then created 3 versions of the Series A deck in over 2 weeks. We went to our investors, we just rehashed it until we had a story that we can go to market with. Then we tested on a couple of the dream investors to see what the perception was. And then we picked a couple of nice to have investors, and then maybe one of the tier 1 investors. So rather than going to your whole dream team first, we started testing out our initial deck. And I'd say Wilfred actually made the most useful addition, which was the pipeline of IP that we're planning to build out over the next 8 years, and all of our moonshot initiatives as well. It's basically really defining what are we going to build over X amount of years to get to $1 billion, not just to get to the Series B or the Series A plus or whatever you want to call it. So I'd say, that the main thing is that after you've got the Series A deck, and let's say you've got a valuation, like the first valuation that we got was, I think it was like a quarter of what we ended up with. And you've just got to go back and refine your deck. Usually when a VC gives a low valuation, it isn't the fact that your company is potentially worth that much. I think it's just because maybe you didn't pitch it in the right way. And what we did is we were just trying to figure out, okay, we know that this is going to be $1 billion company if we execute this correctly. And the valuations that we're getting weren't representative of that. So what do we have to do to prove that we have the know-how to execute that whole pipeline? So it's just these little adjustments that we kept adding. And then it got to the point where, we got the term sheet from Makers Funds, and then a lot of the industry changed their mind, and we got an extra 20 million in offers after that.
I think the reason why we raised so much capital so quickly is because we are addressing a big problem. So that would be my first advice, make sure you are addressing a big problem. And we are addressing it with a much better solution than what is existing today. And so I think that's a second very important thing to have in mind. If you don't feel like you have a very strong product market fit, or if you don't feel like you are solving very, very big problems for your customers, maybe you should not fundraise. You should first focus on finding this strong product market fit. But then if you are addressing a big issue with a strong product market fit, and if you are building a very good team around it, I think you are very well positioned to fundraise, and that's where you should go for it. And my advice here would be, if you have these three dimensions, to spend some time with the VCs that you know about or you heard about, and try to work with the best ones. And also the same thing, and do your due diligence. Like for hiring, you will spend a lot of time with your investors. Do your due diligence, talk to other entrepreneurs, learn about the VCs, and pick the best ones, because great VCs can make a big difference.
It's a constant challenge in lots of different ways. I think there is that kind of team dynamic that I've talked about already, and that's something that I spend quite a lot of time thinking about and working on. I think also when you're a first-time CEO, and I had not fundraised myself before. I'd supported James with our Series B, but doing it yourself, being on the front line, pitching, closing a round, and also just working with your investors, treating them like your customers. That was all new to me. I hadn't had that exposure before. And I also, I raised our Series C with huge support from our team last year while I was pregnant as well. So that was like this whole other dynamic that was quite tough because, for me physically, it was a tough pregnancy. And so you're sort of on Zoom, 3-4 pitches a day and sort of this like real focus and putting all your energy into this. And then sort of as soon as the Zoom call's finished, you're sort of, okay, like deflate a little bit, try to reinflate before the next one. And so in a weird way, I was a real beneficiary of COVID in that last year it was possible to do it all by Zoom. Like I didn't have to be getting on planes to New York or San Francisco. And so that made it a lot easier.
I think there was a misconception going into it that investors would like tell me what to do or boss me around. And I've never actually personally come across that many founders where that's the case. Often we're driven by our own expectations and our own ambitions more than our investors. So that was, I think, a misconception that you've got these big, bad, meanie investors like bossing you around. None of my investors do that because they're great and they also respect that it's my business. So that was a really interesting learning. And also, I don't think of them as my boss, but I do quite like having people kind of above or, whatever it is around me to help give me structure. I like a bit of that, like, okay, every quarter I need to have a board meeting and talk about progress and the milestones. That's actually can really help for me shape like my job as a founder. And in the early days, it's almost like so loose that it's quite hard to even like report back to anyone or anything because you're just basically on your own running it, not really sure how it's going.
I always say to people, like, my number one piece of advice is don't listen to everybody's advice. Only listen when everyone's telling you the same thing. So the advice that I give, like, it's just my opinion. And I like opining on things, clearly. But fundraising, where do I start? I think it's probably most interesting for me to talk about it from the perspective of being a woman and trying to fundraise as a woman, and actually probably why we ended up with brilliant investors like Checker, Ada, like Also, who are a female-run and female-focused German VC, and a lot of our angels are female-focused as well. Little did I know that there was this ecosystem when we first started out, but I think it's so important that female founders try to seek out female investors, because the only way that we can change a very broken system of only 1.8% of funding going to women is by getting more representation on both sides of the table. So when we started, both Maurice and I were doing the pitches together. We learned pretty quickly that doesn't work. I think kind of basic human psychology, people like building a bond with one person. It's harder to do it with two people, especially on Zoom. So then we canned that after our pre-seed, which we did successfully raise, but it was harder than it probably should have been. Then went to just me pitching, and I think it's very hard to explain the experience, because people always, when you talk about difficulty and you talk about being treated differently, people want like a big scary example that they can fully conceptualize and fully understand. Like they want, for them to believe that raising money as a woman is harder, they want to hear that like you've been told that you're less capable than a man and that you're going to go off on maternity leave immediately. Like that doesn't happen. People aren't that brazen and obvious. But you just end up in situations where, I'll answer questions and then they would speak back to Maurice and completely ignore that I'd spoken. At times where you're asked, preventative questions that are much more accusatory about why you've started that business rather than opportunistic questions like how big can that get? Just various different, like very small, very difficult to put your finger on kind of microaggressions, and you just have to kind of plow on and ignore the people that are doing that, and eventually you'll find the investors that don't see women as a negative, they see them as a positive, because at best you feel like you're kind of neutral.
I think that fundraising is a lot harder. That's just fact. Let's call it what it is, and it's fundamentally supply and demand. People are like, oh my gosh, the VCs have moved the goalpost, things are getting so much harder. I'm like, yeah, they have. because the market's moved and investors aren't charity givers. They need to generate returns for their LPs. And so I always go back to like understand macro situation first. And so I always go back to the team. I'm like, look, the way markets work is you go interest rates go up, public markets go down, therefore late stage private equity goes down, therefore earlier stage goes down as well. That's just fact. So we just have to adjust to that. In the same way that if we're a public company, markets go up and down, and that's just life. And so I think the first thing that really helped us was just going, this is the new reality. Just own it. And there's going to be times when you fundraise in good times, and there's going to be times when you're going to fundraise in bad times. And you can't control those things. All you can do is control what you can control, which is like build a great company and just get really good at fundraising in the context you're in. We found that the investors who believed in the long-term thesis were 10 times easier to sell to than those who are like FOMO investors who are sort of just like jumping on the bandwagon. I think about like the investors jumping on generative AI right now. Like for me, if I was building a generative AI startup, I would have really focused on the investors who had a thesis in this 3 years ago before it was like a hot sector. And so we always found that the investors who just had a strong thesis in fintech over the long run were just much, much easier to get over the line in the sense of they got the space. I wasn't trying to sell them on the industry. I was just trying to sell them that we were the company to back in the industry versus companies who are like, oh, fintech isn't very exciting anymore. It's like, look, I'm not going to try and turn your opinion around fintech being an attractive industry. It's just like I have zero ability to do that. It's such a hard thing. Again, I would say in general, it is really, really hard to change someone's opinion. So don't bother. Find the investors who really believe in the thesis and really believe in the space. And for us, actually, part of it was just it was a lot of talk about product market fit. I think there's actually an element of investor company fit as well. And so I don't need to find 100 investors. I need to find 2 or 3 who believe in our sector and believe in what we're doing as well. So I think that's for me, a really, really useful way of thinking about it. I would say the second thing is like just fundamentals matter. Building a good business matters again, which I think is probably good. I think the discipline of actually work your way down the P&L, right? At the very top is customers times by revenue equals top line revenue minus gross costs equals gross margin minus SG&A equals EBITDA. And so actually like seed investors are trying to find companies that have product market fit or some degree of it, right? So that's just like the first line, which is like customers. Multiplied by, do you have some way of making money? Some like light form of monetization. That's top line revenue. Minus gross cost is gross margin. So as you go to B rounds, gross margin matters. And then work down your P&L where like EBITDA matters by the time you get to growth stage investors like Series B, C+. That's like fundamentally it. That's like not that new. If you're running a local cafe in Old Street, those are the same things you have to think about. So those like fundamentals don't change. And so I think going back to like, what is a fundamentally good business, full stop, is what you should focus on. And I think that, yes, there's all fundraising strategies and all that. And I think there's a whole bunch written about fundraising strategies and they're really, really helpful. But I think what you can control is build a great business and then let the market decide valuation. And our general mindset is, look, people are like, I don't want a down round, I don't want a flat round, I want an up round, I want to have a 2x multiple. I'm like, look, honestly, valuation's all basically bullcrap. Right now, it's just make sure you have enough capital to continue to grow your business and let the market decide valuations. The same way the market decides public market valuations, like you don't really get to pick, the market picks. And then sometimes in a bull market, your valuation will be great. In a bad market, valuation will be bad. So what? Like just roll with it and keep going. And I think that's one thing that we've just found really helpful as like a way of thinking about the problem.
It's amazing how when you bootstrap things, because you don't have a lot of money, you don't even think to spend money. You know, it's not even like an option. Like my friend Adam did the logo, which is still the same logo today.
Good for Adam.
Yeah, he nailed it first time. I paid him £500. You know, like that was the brand. Like I went around Adam's house and we sat there and we were like, I really like that navy blue, I really like that pink, and I really like that green. And we were like, great. And you know, so I love looking back at like what we spent and how you can keep things really like hacky and, you know, simple in those days. You know, I filed my own trademark application because obviously I'm not going to pay a lawyer to do that. Like I'll just sit there for hours trying to figure out which classes we fit into. And I learned loads in the process. Like it was really interesting. I, learned about everything. So I loved it. But also I want to build a really big, successful company that continues to impact and improve millions of women's lives. And a lot of people sort of assumed I'd maybe go down like the charity route or the non-profit route, which is where historically a lot of contraceptive things are. But I was like, no, that's exactly the reason I don't want to go down that route, because no offense, but they haven't got that much money. Their experience isn't great. And you're going to get lumped in the same pool of NGOs and companies fighting for the same grants, which I just had no interest in doing or experience in knowing how to do. So yeah, it was quite obvious to me that I wanted to go down the VC route to really build something truly fantastic. And it was almost like my duty to women at that point, given that how successful the initial platform was, to give it a really good shot. So that's kind of how I ended up going into the VC route. I mean, you only really learn this through doing. No one actually teaches you how to actually fundraise. And by that, I mean how to send an intro email correctly, how to write the email that you send to investors. There's a lot of stuff on the internet about how to write the perfect pitch deck, but there's not actually stuff about the logistics of contacting, scheduling, thanking, following up, responding to people within 24 hours, taking that second call, preparing for that, providing the data room, all of those little bits you have to learn as you're doing. And the first time you do, you have no idea what you're doing. And you're just WhatsApping people the whole time being like, they've asked me this, do I do this or do I do this? And it's pretty horrible, actually. I actually spoke to a bunch of female founders about this a few weeks ago, and I started to write a Word document about it. If anyone listening wants to read it, it's just the stuff that I wish I'd known, that this assumed knowledge, which I think often gets shared between founders. But if you're potentially a new or a female founder, and because there's less of us, maybe there's less of us to share the knowledge and the culture and the logistics knowledge, that I just feel really strongly is very important. I also wish I'd met my coach before I fundraised. I have a fantastic coach called Mika. The amount that has helped me process and externalize and plan and strategize about what I'm doing, I wish I had a coach while I was fundraising. That would have really, really helped me as well.
I'll say the opportunities to solve the problem are twofold. So on one side, I've seen a gap across the whole VC community or impact funds that aim to solve this problem, which is the fact that if you've got a risk profile of who you are and aren't going to invest in, and that's a standard risk profile across any VC, and then you've got the fact that you're only going to concentrate on a very small segment of the market, which is ethnic minority founders or Black founders, for instance. What I've seen is that the risk profile increases and the effort of getting that capital is much harder. Now, I can safely say this, and I'm not going to mention the names, obviously, but we were rejected 3 times from a specific fund. And look how well we've done. So in terms of the risk profile adjustment that needs to occur, or the model that is used to assess the risk of investing in a startup, that drastically needs to change because... And again, I can safely say this now, we definitely shouldn't have got investment from some of the funds that we approached. But on the flip side, and this is easier said than done, we've actually got a mentorship scheme that we've got in Audiomob. The way that you perceive media, right? In terms of, there's not a lot of money going to Black founders. There's negative things in the media, whether it's Black founders, ethnic minorities, women, etc. The way that I try and approach things, and again, this is easier said than done because it's based on a lived experience, but I always approach every single goal as if none of that stuff existed and that there's no ceiling, that I could go to, the biggest fund and ask for any valuation that I wanted. And that's how I approach every single conversation. It's that, I have ejected all thoughts out of my mind that for me to achieve and Wilfred to achieve what we've achieved, I'm at any disadvantage because I look the way that I do. And that is a very, very hard concept to adopt depending on your lived experience. But it's something that has been very, very helpful for me, whether it's getting jobs at Google or Facebook or, raising this round.
I personally really like the personal side of pitching and working with angels. I feel like there's a genuineness to the relationship and they can help you see how the VC space sees you. So they can be this amazing sort of prism of, especially someone like Ian, who can within 20 minutes analyze like either what's going wrong or right with your fundraise and how people are receiving it and why either the story's working or not working. So angels are absolutely critical for that. It's just quicker, isn't it? They don't have a team. They kind of often make the decision on the first call, and they're quite quick to tell you. They're very respectful of your time in general, because most of them have been founders and understand how hard it is and the process that you're running is. So I just love that sort of inbuilt preparation that they have to truly help you with what you need then and there. And if it's not investing in you, then that's fine. I've actually had some brilliant discussions with angels who never invested, but I still look at the notes from our calls like a year later and I'm like, yeah, that was such a good point. I really need to do that. So I kind of mop it all up and say, thanks so much for your time. I'd love to come back to you. And that's that.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40 Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40 Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.